Welcome to Network Capital, Tripurdaman. Our networks, our worlds intersect in so many different ways. I'm glad that you're finally here. We're going to talk about your book, your career. Tell us what piques your curiosity and what do you do today?
First, thank you so much for inviting me, Utkarsh. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm so glad that we are finally being able to do this. What piques my curiosity? You're really throwing me into the deep end there. I think a lot of things pique my curiosity, but specifically, I think the past really appeals to me in many ways. And partly that is because there's so much of the present that really can be explained by reference to the past, or that can be understood by reference to the past. But also, secondly, I just find it interesting. I find the idea of going back to primary papers and digging through archives or sources. Archives, of course, are only one kind of source, but it's a bit like it's a bit like piecing together a puzzle, being able to put together, investigating a subject, being able to put together a narrative around it, being able to argue out your point. They kind of have a thrill of their own, and I find that really interests me, and it's one of these things that gets your adrenaline pumping, and so for me that's always been this kind of thrill. And I'm glad that I'm able to do it professionally as well.
So you've done something really interesting. You've made your passion your profession, and your curiosity is, what pays the bills as well. So tell us a bit about your work.
That's true. I've been very lucky to be able to do that. And I started out studying politics at the University of Warwick, where I was an undergraduate. I then did a MPhil in South Asian Studies at Cambridge. And during my MPhil, I got to know my supervisor, Sir Christopher Bailey. He was a sort of giant, of the field. And I got to know him, and I worked on my MPhil thesis with him, which in some ways was quite a revelation, because I'd never really done any primary research before. When you're an undergraduate, it's things are quite sort of straightforward. And then I really enjoyed it. I really liked Cambridge, and he suggested, why don't you think about a PhD? And I thought, yeah, why not? I'd have 4 years to really think, to get to grips with my subject, to be in a place like Cambridge. And so I did my PhD. It took longer than I'd anticipated because, Chris passed away. But it really sort of ignited a kind of thrill in me. It kind of ignited something in me that I had never quite had before. I'd always been interested in history, but never in this sort of research work and academic work. And I really loved it. I really enjoyed it. And of course, it was a bit of an uphill struggle once I finished my PhD, because of course, there's nothing waiting at the end of the tunnel. You have this big moment where you achieve something which is, you've finally written this 80,000, 100,000 word piece of research, which is, original, and you often think of it and frame it, and this is, my life's work, but it's really not. And it's only, I guess, because it takes over your life, and then once you finish with it, you kind of realize, well, that was that, and what comes next? And what comes next is a kind of quite grueling sort of time where you really have to figure out what to do next, because academic positions, research funding, all of these things are few and far between, and there are probably 10 times as many candidates for anything as there are positions, or as there are grants. And so I had quite but of course, everything's a matter of perspective, but I had a slightly difficult sort of year after I graduated, where I was kind of coming to grips with, what I should do. I, of course, had at that point failed to get an academic position. I think I must have done at least something around the number of 40 to 50 applications, which were rejected from
Yeah.
various places for funding grants, for research fellowships, for lectureships, so on and so forth. And so I finally got it was quite I would say almost down and out, where I considered, well, maybe this isn't something that I can do, and maybe this isn't something for me. And then by a quirk of fate, I ended up meeting another very another mentor, should I say, which was Professor Maina at the School of Advanced Study. And I told him about what I was doing, and he encouraged me to apply through the School of Advanced Study for a research grant. Of course, he backed up my application, and the School of Advanced Study, of course, was happy to support my application, and that's how I got my sort of first big research grant, which was the British Academy. And I guess that was really the start of it. So I'm still at the School of Advanced Study. I'm still a British Academy Fellow there, and in that period, I've written 3 books, which have all kind of done well in their own ways. And it's been, of course, in some senses, quite hard work, but it's also been an exhilarating, journey of sorts.
Can you talk to us about exhilaration and frustration and feeling dejected? Because once you graduated and applied for 40, 50 positions, for whatever reason, they did not work out. I'm sure it wasn't fun. So this is something that many of our
yeah
folks from around the world can relate to. Talk to us how you figured out the next steps.
Well, there was, I mean, partly, of course, for most people, this is how the journey works out. I mean, post PhD is, I think it's different in the sciences because there's more of your skills are quite easily transferable to, to other domains. Whereas something like history is, while not domain specific, I mean, those skills, academic positions itself are few and far between, and it doesn't, I mean, those are specialist skills, being able to investigate something that deeply, being able to find your way through, find information, research, write, think critically. I mean, those are great skills, but then often not really, it's not a recognizable sort of transition. So you will occasionally find people who've done history PhDs, for example, going into consulting or something, but it's not as if anybody in the field of consulting will say, well, you're you have a set of skills that we value more than anyone fresh out of university. So they will often go in at the same level as someone fresh out of undergrad. And so for me, while I was going through this process of applying for academic positions and research funding and all of these things, part of me was also thinking, well, what really is the value of the last 5 years that I've been working on my PhD, and it kind of forces you to reflect both on your on how you define your own identity, because at some point you say, well, if I'm not an academic, who am I, what am I? And partly it also really puts everything into perspective, because what you imagined to be such a substantive chunk of your life, such a substantive piece of work, could, once you're done with it, you look back and you're like, well, what value does it really have beyond the tiny niche of academia? And for me, I think that was the most challenging part, was to keep a strong sense of self while going through this process, because you often end up questioning your choices. You question the value of what you've done. You question whether you're good enough to really step up, whether you're capable of stepping up to beyond where you were. And So for me, that was the most sort of challenging part, was to continue to have faith in yourself and continue to value what you've done, to think, well,
Hmm.
what you've done is of value, and what you want to do is also of value. Because once you have 30 rejection, 40 rejections, there's no way that you wouldn't question yourself. I mean, it would to me, it's quite a normal thing. And there, of course, in my case, well, it worked out, but or it worked out in a manner of speaking, I guess. But there was every possibility that it may not have worked out.
Hmm.
And to kind of be able to extricate yourself, or step back enough to say, well, even if it doesn't work out, what I've done is of value. And there was nothing wrong with spending X number of time, 4 years, 5 years, doing something. And there's also nothing wrong with turning your back on what it was that you were passionate about or that you wanted to do, in case things just don't turn out that way. And I guess it requires this ability to step back and think clearly. And for me, that wasn't easy. Like, it took me quite a long time to be able to extricate myself and what I thought I was, or who I thought I was, from what I was doing. And that's what essentially created the space to be able to think clearly about the situation.
And that objectivity led to the exhilaration, 3 books, good recognition nationally, internationally. Talk to us about that feeling and also give us a flavor of the 3 books that you've written.
Yeah. And so, being able to think, I guess, clearly, I had also decided that, I was going to give myself a certain amount of time. And if things didn't sort of work out within that time, I was going to say, well, okay, that's one part of my life over, and we need to do something else. But luckily they did. And it was quite a cathartic feeling to be able to do it, to have gotten something. Because even though we we all know it's hit and miss, we all know that it's at the end of the day, when you think about, with something like these big grants, something like 5% of the applications are successful. So
Hmm.
that the odds are against you. And so it isn't a sort of honest reflection. And everyone who's going up is, there's very little to choose from. Everybody's, ticks the boxes. And so even though you theoretically recognize that this is not really a reflection on who you are and what you've done, it's still very cathartic to kind of get that sort of recognition, to be able to tick that box, to say, okay, well,
Hmm.
someone believes in your work enough that they're willing to fund it, or they're willing to take a punt on what's going to come out of it. And so that was very very cathartic. And I was very conscious that I needed to prove something, both to, of course, the world, but also to myself. Having gone through that period of self-doubt and self-reflection, I felt, it was up to me to really to produce something that would demonstrate, especially to myself, that I was, up to the mark. And that's how that's how I started working on what eventually became my second book. My first one came out of my PhD. It was
Hmm.
reworking of my thesis. It's something that I'd been working on for 5-6 years. So eventually, of course, that's what became my first book. But my second book, I took up only about a short while, maybe 9 months, I think, or a year before I got the British Academy. And I took it up as a way of demonstrating to myself that I could produce a substantive, interesting, and a piece of kind of historical research that would appeal to a wide audience, both within and beyond the academy. Because, of course, when you're an academic, you often kind of get trapped in this setting where you're constantly only looking up to your peers and writing for them, taking feedback from them. And I was conscious that I wanted to do something, something more. And so as a method of really proving to myself, I started working on this second book, which eventually was published as 16 Stormy Days, the story of the First Amendment to the Constitution of India. And that it actually did, the reception to it was much better than I thought. And it turned out to be both critically and commercially successful. Its readers liked it, and it was reviewed all over in most sort of outlets, press outlets, magazines, newspapers, academic journals, and so it to have seen that was, I guess, for me, it was a method of proving to myself that I was up to the task, and I think it was kind of necessary for me to do it, just as a way of exercising my own demons and my own insecurities. And after that, it brought in its trail came a certain amount of recognition, invitations to speak at events, appear on podcasts, and I haven't. I'd say I haven't sort of looked back from there, but it was, while I was working on the book, I was very conscious that this was a test that I had set myself, and I had given myself again a kind of very short timeline of about 1.5 years to be able to finish it in. It again was very hard work to put a book of that sort together within a period of about 1.5 years. But again, I even though it required, it effectively required me to become a hermit and do nothing else but work for that period. I think it was justified to I can justify it to myself, seeing as what the book has achieved. And then the third one, of course, I was talking to one of my friends who is used to be at the University of Leiden, and we've known each other since we were PhD students, and a lot of our research interests overlap, and we thought it would be interesting to write a book together, and that's what we did. So it was born out of this kind of quite a shared curiosity and a shared interest with a close friend. And normally it's always, you often think that one shouldn't write with friends because there's the idea that you could rub each other up the wrong way to such an extent that your friendship may not survive. But luckily for us, it was the opposite.
It sort of brought you both closer.
Yeah, and we found the process of writing, of actually judging each other's work and commenting on what the other person had written, actually quite fun.
So is there a connecting thread between among the three books?
There is. So my first one, of course, dealt with these sort of quite localized princely polities in 19th century India, and part of the reason was that I had an interest in that period, and partly it was, of course, because my supervisor was the world's leading authority on in 18th and 19th century India. So it was born out of that, but by the time I finished, I realized that I was slightly bored of working on 18th and 19th century subjects, but B, because I had written about the ideas of sovereignty and the concept of law in the 19th 18th and 19th century, I actually courtesy that became more interested in the subject of the 20th century, just because uh, after I'd finished school, I toyed with the idea of doing law and of studying law. And at that point, of course, I decided against it. But, it's something that was just there in the back of my head. But working um, on law as a concept in the 18th and 19th century India, it sort of really got me thinking, and it got me reading around questions about India's constitution and what sort of thinking went into the making of it, and that really led me fairly and squarely into the mid 20th century and the birth of the Indian Republic, independence, and so that resulted in my second and my third books, which both in some ways deal with that period and that subject.
You're one of those people who've built his category of one in connecting the dots like a contrarian. So there's a bit of going against the mainstream and trying to present an argument. And I saw that when you were discussing political figures. So do you want to give us a flavor of the early days of writing, say the 16 Stormy days, when you talk about a specific person, a specific context, a specific period? How did that emerge?
So for me, there were two reasons. One, of course, was that literature on the First Amendment to the Constitution was, quite rare. There are maybe not even really a handful of papers that have really been written on it. And so for me, it was a subject ripe for exploration and something that's had, such huge consequences that people acknowledge in passing, but don't really want to touch upon, because it's one of these slightly embarrassing moments in our history where which you aren't able to easily categorize or slot. And it's the entire story in itself is so counterintuitive, because first, just the fact that not that many people knew about it, which I found puzzling given how consequential it was. Second, the fact that despite knowing how consequential it was, we'd had very little writing on it. There are 2 or 3 academic papers, and that's about it. And then third, it showed the whole story. It really showed things in a light that I hadn't expected. So, of course, we know the pivotal figures in the story. There's Jawaharlal Nehru, who's Prime Minister, Ambedkar, who's Law Minister, Shah Prasad Mukherjee, who's Leader of Opposition, Jyotram Kriplani, who's then leaving the Congress, former Congress president, leaves the Congress in its first sort of flush of power. So it's a very interesting cast of characters, and everything that they say and do is quite counterintuitive. It's what you wouldn't expect. It's what their present images sort of don't convey, which is, Nehru, whose current image is that of a sort of genteel patrician liberal, Mukherjee, whose image is of, as the founder of the Bharatiya Janata Sangh, later the BJP, as someone who's sort of unabashed Hindu nationalist, the progenitor, if one might call it, of the current BJP. Ambedkar, who's again seen as the sort of father of constitutionalism, and everyone's actions there sort of in a way kind of challenge current day assumptions, and the entire story just sort of I just found it, as the deeper I went into it, the more exciting I found it, because everything just moves so fast. People, everything happens within a span of just over 16 months, and it was such a dramatic episode that I was surprised that no one else had really thought that it merited a book length treatment in itself. And given that there was none, I felt, well, here's a niche that I can fill, and here's a story that I think is worth worth putting effort into, because it's it's not just exciting and it's not just illuminating, but it's also relevant to current day concerns, questions about freedom of speech, and all of these things, which in India especially, I've in the last few years kind of really caught people's attention. And so all of those threads really came together, and it was in some ways a quirk of fate, I guess, that that I ended up working on it.
Yeah, and you're able to connect the dots between personalities, ways of working, about the Indian mindset. So tell us a bit about Nehru from your point of view. A lot of our community members may not be Indian. They would need more of an orientation. Those from India would, or the South Asian region, would be familiar.
Yes. So, I mean, just a quick sort of aside on connecting the dots is that's actually what makes historical research so interesting. Is this, it's like, in a sense, it's like being Sherlock Holmes. You go and you pick up clues, you pick up material, you pick up things, but in and of themselves, they're just, they're just clues. They're just sort of pieces of information, and to be able to fit it together, in a sense, in a broad-based narrative, is what makes it appealing to me. And so that's a book that I can also say that I really enjoyed writing. Coming to Nehru, of course, was India's first prime minister. And by virtue of being the first prime minister, he also has an overwhelming presence in the Indian consciousness. He in effect shaped the Indian Republic. And given that he had as much of a blank slate as it's possible to have in history, he really laid the foundations of Indian democracy. And so, of course, he's revered for being the father of Indian democracy, for being, setting up the Indian Republic, more or less being one of the big influences that shaped the constitution. And then after that, as India's first prime minister and India's longest serving prime minister, I think, he really guided the destinies of an entire subcontinent, more or less. So his influence, like his imprint on India, is so strong that he defines the sort of center point of India's political spectrum. So everything else is kind of defined in degrees of divergence from Nehru. And so when I started looking at the First Amendment, a very different side to Nehru started appearing to me. And Nehru in contemporary discourse is often first pitted against the sort of current Indian government, which is seen to be anti-Nehruvian in a sense, to try and roll back everything that Nehru had stood for, which was widely credited to be, sort of a relatively liberal constitution, a freedom of speech, Indian secularism, and so on and so forth. But the story of the First Amendment clearly brings out that there was a lot more to Nehru as well, and he was, a communitarian. He was someone who was, impatient at many times with democratic procedure. He was someone who believed that the sort of wider social interest, or what he saw to be the wider social interest, as represented by those sitting in the legislature, should really trump constitutional provisions, and also to be able to achieve the ends for which he believed his government had been set up. He was willing to, in a sense, amend constitutional provisions which at that point were just about a year old. And this was no storm in a teacup, as one might say, but something that aroused a profound pushback from the opposition. And I don't just mean the parliamentary opposition. I also mean, organizations such as the All India Newspaper Editors Conference, the Federation of the Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, the bar associations, and so on and so forth. And it's interesting that this episode didn't get a sort of book length treatment, primarily because given what India was at that point, it hadn't even had its first election. It's often assumed that this was just a sort of intra-elite sort of squabble, that this was just the top echelons of Indian society kind of having a fight amongst themselves, which in some senses maybe it was. But it's interesting to see that despite the fact it didn't attract, even when it happened, that it was not an issue of great public concern, we still had these sort of institutional checks and balances, an opposition that was willing to take such a firm stand in Parliament, or newspaper editors that were willing to sort of raise their heads above the parapet to kind of oppose a government measure, or something like the Chambers of Commerce and Industry, where now it's often just assumed that businessmen toe the government line and don't really risk political blowback. But it's interesting to see just what was possible in 1950, 1951. And I think that really, for me, that was one of the things that really, was worth bringing to light.
And you do force the reader to reconsider many opinions, many facts, and you're able to actually surprisingly paint a picture of a Nehru that is different from what people would have read about. Did that shock you when you were reading it? Because you also grew up reading the same books, I would imagine, in school and college, or having similar conversations. Or was that something that you were acquainted with?
It did surprise me. I mean, I was acquainted with certain elements of it by virtue of having, read a lot more of him than I guess the average person, because I was studying politics and then history, and you can sense that, of course, that Nehru was quite a contradictory figure in some senses, but. Of course, it was well known that he was, he wrote about it himself, that he was someone who was impatient. He had a bit of a temper. He, was slightly authoritarian in outlook. And those were things he wrote about himself. So, he didn't seek to hide them either. But it's only when you put the whole story together that you appreciate just what, saying those things meant. And for me, it was very surprising to, I guess, I wouldn't say shocking, because I kind of expected it, but I didn't expect it to the extent that it became apparent.
So what made the 16 stormy days stormy? Were there discussions about the future of India? Give us a flavor.
So, well, the stormy days refers to the 16 days of debate that happen in Parliament when the amendment is presented to them. And the reason, well, of course, the debates themselves are stormy, but a very interesting episode happens during the debate, which is at some point after Nehru has presented the amendment, an opposition figure called Naziruddin Ahmad is speaking. He is, of course, tremendously critical. He's savaging the bill. And just as he's doing it, a storm hits New Delhi. And the storm hits so suddenly, and there's a newspaper report saying, the storm hits so suddenly that actually they don't have enough time to close the skylights and the windows and things in Parliament. And so, several members get drenched in the rain, but also there's a power cut, and so the chamber is plunged into darkness. Sorry. And as that happens, an opposition figure, actually he's not even an opposition figure, he's a dissident congressman, H.V. Kamath, he gets up and he says, well, freedom of speech is being taken away, and there's a storm over it. And it's one of these kind of quite, I guess, evocative moments during the debate and during the story that I thought, it was really, it was a really kind of good example of what was going on. And I think the metaphor was just too good to let go. And
I agree.
so that's how I came up with the title.
So you're saying that the freedom of expression, freedom of speech was being curtailed by the way, and what made you come to that conclusion? And how do you think it has altered the freedom of speech discussions today?
That's not a conclusion that just I came to. That was a conclusion that even those who were opposing the amendment had come to. And of course, that's because what Nehru had proposed to do, and of course what he did, was to increase the grounds under which laws curtailing the freedom of speech could be passed. So originally, the Constitution had only envisaged, had set the bar quite high, and which included, I think, libel, slander, contempt of court, and anything that undermined the security of the state or tended to overthrow it. Now, what that had done is that had made it impossible for the government to use the various public safety acts to prosecute, to ban magazines, to subject them to censorship, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, equally, it had ensured that the law of sedition, which they often use to arrest people saying inconvenient things, had been made unconstitutional. And you had a series of cases over 1950 that kind of reinforced this situation. So every time the government famously arrested Tara Singh of the Akali Dal for sedition, and the court let him go by saying, well, sedition, section 124A of the Penal Code, which is sedition, is basically unconstitutional. And this also happened with when they tried to censor The Organizer, which is the RSS news magazine, or they tried to ban Crossroads, which was a sort of left-leaning weekly published from Bombay. And so the courts kind of made it apparent that freedom of speech was quite expansive, that the bar which needed to be crossed for legislation to curtail it was really high, and the government basically then felt that actually things are moving out of control, that there was in a sense too much freedom. And so what the amendment did was that it introduced several new grounds under which freedom of speech could be curtailed, which included public order, and more disingenuously, it changed the phrase anything that undermined the security of the state or tended to overthrow it. That phrase was changed to anything in the interests of the security of the state. So you no longer had needed something merely had to be in the interest of the state's security for there to be a law prescribing it, prescribing freedom of speech or curtailing freedom of speech. It no longer needed to undermine the state's security or bring it to a point where the state might be overthrown. So the Overton window, in a sense, was kind of widened considerably by this amendment.
And this makes you think about the current political climate. Do you think so?
Yeah, I mean, it has quite eerie echoes, in a sense, from of the current political climate, because actually at that point, those who were the most vociferous opponents of this amendment, which was S.P. Mukherjee and also parts of the RSS, are now in power. And those who are now at the receiving end of the kind of legal architecture that this amendment allowed are now in the opposition. And it's interesting to note that while the sides have changed, the language that's deployed really hasn't. So from the government side, you still get the language of, well, the state's under threat, or there's too much freedom, or freedom of speech is being abused because of it. I sort of I'll give you a quick example. Is when Nehru speaks in Parliament, he one of the things he's really upset about is fake news, and he says, it's really difficult to determine which news is real, which news is fake, and think of think of the effect this fake news will have on on our farmers and on our soldiers and on our young people and so on and so forth. And it's interesting to see that those are similar concerns that are being deployed now. It's just that those who are in power are now in the opposition, and those who were then in the opposition are now in power. The funny thing is that at the end of the debate, Nehru, describes the amendment as a gift that he's leaving for the succeeding generations, and he's warned at that point by S.V. Mukherjee, who says, well, it's possible that you and your succeeding generations might rule for eternity, but you should stop and think about what will be the consequence of what you're doing in case someone else comes into power. And of course, at that point, no one imagines anyone else coming into power, and that warning is brushed aside. And then now, about 6 months ago, I remember for some, I'm not quite sure for what, but as one of the BJP leaders had declared that they were going to file 1,000 sedition cases against Congress leader Rahul Gandhi. And to me, that was just such an instructive moment to see how things had kind of turned, after going through 360 degrees, had come back to the same point, because there was 70 odd years ago, 72 years ago, really, there was Rahul Gandhi's great-grandfather describing it as a gift for the succeeding generations. And to me, it was just so surreal to see, how, while history, I wouldn't say history repeats itself, I would say just, how history sort of rhymes with the present.
Yeah. I don't want to speculate, and I don't want you to go into Nehru's mind, but could you attempt to explain the rationale or the thought process about what might Nehru be thinking around that time, and what were the kinds of people who were opposing his points of view on this particular subject, and why weren't they listened to, or why didn't they emerge victorious in those arguments?
I mean, I don't have to speculate, because there's a lot of literature around it, because they do discuss why they're doing this. And for Nehru, I think the trump card was the fact that he felt that he needed these laws to sort of protect his government against what he called bullying, which was that there was at that point in time, there had been quite a lot of disturbance in what was then East Pakistan, and a lot of refugees had come into India. And so, there'd been a lot of protests and a lot of public outcry against the government's attitude. A lot of people, both within and outside the Congress, had been trying to pressurize Nehru into taking sterner action against Pakistan, which is something that he didn't want to do. And to be able to, I guess, in a way, clamp down on that line of thought, he needed legal tools. And so that was one of the main reasons that was driving him in the context of freedom of speech. Another big question for the amendment was zamindari abolition, which Nehru believed was potentially under threat. It actually wasn't, and many people, including the president, Rajendra Prasad, kind of pointed out that there was no real threat to zamindari abolition. But for Nehru, it was a matter of principle, saying, well, we got elected promising this. We've been promising this for 20, 30 odd years, and we can't now hold back by saying what we promised was against the constitution, is unconstitutional. So the constitution, in that sense, and he makes the claim, and he says it to the press, that the legislature is what decides on policy, and they represent the will of the people, and in that sense the constitution cannot come cannot be an impediment to something like this. It's a very, I would say, unusual position to take in the context of a constitution that is written and so long. It codifies things to such an extent that it shouldn't normally leave room for this sort of an argument to be made, but he makes it nevertheless. And I think it's just a matter of expediency, because at some point you come under a lot of pressure and you say, well, the easiest thing for me would be if the constitutional provisions themselves, which is different, and he decides to go ahead and do it. And he has there's no doubting that he has the parliamentary support, because the measure is passed ultimately, and it's also held to be legal by the Supreme Court. And of course, it never really figures in the election that happens after, which probably would, in my mind, imply that first, people didn't really care that much, and second, that even if they had, they probably would have supported Nehru anyway, given the sort of overwhelming adulation that he commanded. Now, the people who oppose him are a more interesting bunch, because they come from quite a wide spectrum of political opinion. There are what might be called figures of the Hindu right, people like S.P. Mukherjee and M.R. Jayakar, who had previously been the Mahasabha president, N.C. Chatterjee, who had previously been, I think, Hindu Mahasabha president as well. And then you had sort of remnants of what had been the Gandhian faction in the Congress, people like Acharya Kripalani. And then you have effectively socialists like Jayaprakash Narayan, S.N. Saxena, and these people. You have the few liberals that there were, people like Kunzru. And on top of that, you have these civil societies organizations, as I mentioned, the newspaper editors, bar associations, the chambers of commerce and industry. So you have quite a wide spectrum of opinion that that kind of comes together to oppose Nehru's amendment. Ultimately, they're not successful, and I think it's you see it during the debates, of course, that they don't have enough parliamentary or street power to really change the course of the amendment itself. And for Nehru, of course, there are three things. They represent shades of opinion that he doesn't quite have time for. So he doesn't have time for sort of Hindu right. He doesn't have time for old school traditional liberals. He doesn't really have time for the more radical socialists. And he also doesn't really, he thinks the sort of chambers of commerce and industry and newspaper editors conference, etc., represent a kind of conservative opinion, remnants of what he might call a static age. And so he is quite confident that he has the masses with him. He is quite confident of getting the amendment through. He isn't really thinking about the long-term consequences, partly because maybe he doesn't think that they are going to materialize. Partly, he's also not thinking about the precedents that he's laying. Again, one can't say whether he's thinking about it and ignoring it, or just not thinking about it at all. And partly it's also expediency. There's an election coming up. They've been promising something to the electorate. They want to get it through. And Nehru ultimately says, well, you should trust Parliament, you should trust us. And, that's ultimately the amendment is passed. And in a nutshell, I think the reason they weren't listened to, the opponents weren't listened to, was that there was no real need to do it. It was perfectly possible to ignore them.
Do you think India would be very different today had that amendment not been passed?
Oh, yes, very much so. I mean, maybe someone else would have passed it, or maybe not. That's an open question. But if the constitution had stayed as it is, and if, say, for example, sedition had never really been brought back onto the books as it was, or freedom of the threshold for laws curtailing the freedom of speech had continued to remain that high, I think India would be in a much Indian democracy would be significantly more secure. But it's also possible to argue at the equal point that actually, the state would have been threatened, and the government might have splintered, and so on and so forth. I'm sure it is possible to argue those points, but personally, I believe that that we would have been much better off.
Let's look at the fact that Jawaharlal Nehru is the architect, or one of the principal architects, of the Indian democracy. Your work seems to suggest that the report card is not all glowing A's. There are some less, glowing numbers somewhere in between. Overall, when you look at him on these points, do you think that he was acting because he was a person looking for an outcome and he made a mistake visualizing what the future might turn out? Or was there this dictatorial impulse in him, as is there in many, powerful men, quote unquote? Or is there something else? Was India at a time where a lot needed to be done in a short amount of time? So an non-ideal solution, but a practical one, was taken. Which of these options make sense, if any?
I mean, there's something to be said for all of them, right? And of course, the first is he believed that a lot needed to be done, and he believed he was the one who was going to be doing it. And so this was a kind of shortcut that, and again, he says it, he keeps repeating himself when he says, we don't have time, we don't have time. And so for him, of course, that's one consideration, that they don't have that time. He needs to get a lot done. This is an easy sort of way to cut through what might otherwise be legal and constitutional complications. And he does it. And he does it not just with the amendment, he does it, for example, by using an instrument like, which is the ordinance, which is only supposed to be used in, unusual times. And he uses it to bypass sort of normal legislative process quite often, to an extent where even the first sort of Speaker of Parliament, G.V. Mavlankar, makes it a point to write to him and complain about how Parliament is being sidelined. So that's, of course, one reason. The second is that it was, in his eyes, and undoubtedly in the eyes of many others, just a sort of completely justified measure as well. So it's not as if he was, he was alone in doing this. He was ultimately, there was a cabinet committee. There was a parliament that voted on it. So, he was, even though he was opposed by large sections of public opinion, one could say that actually a lot of the parliamentary majority was behind him. So, he's not the only one who thinks that it's that what he's doing is justified. And then lastly, I think partly because he's thinking of the present and of the short term so much, he's either ignoring or just not really, in a sense, thinking about what the long-term consequences are. Now, this is slightly, I don't buy this point to its entirety, because he is being warned against what the long-term consequences might be. So everyone who speaks is constantly telling him, look, these are what the long-term consequences are likely to be. It's going to cause cause the country a lot of problems at some point. But he kind of ignores it, and I think he ignores it because he doesn't quite imagine another dispensation or another ideological orientation coming to power, but B, also just because the question of precedent, given how much of the Westminster system rests on precedents and convention, and he, as India's first prime minister, of a newly found democracy, is laying a precedent, creating conventions by everything that he does. And I don't think he's completely aware about the fact that a precedent laid today might come back to haunt you, 25 years later. And that's also perfectly, in a sense, it's understandable, because if you imagine someone who is more or less running a one-man show, who's being pressed from all sides with, the problems that a newly democratic, newly independent country is facing, it's in a sense understandable that the short term would continue to occupy his mind to a large extent. What's not understandable is why the long-term concerns would kind of be brushed aside in so cavalier a manner. It would be one thing if you kind of took them on board and said, look, here's a reason why I don't think these will materialize. But he doesn't do that. He kind of brushes them aside in quite cavalier a manner. So ultimately, it's hard to boil anything down to one reason. But I do think all of these reasons have something going for them.
We're not interested in politics here or network capital. We're interested in careers and leadership styles. Would you say that Mr. Modi and Mr. Nehru have commonalities in leadership styles and execution strategies?
Yes, very much so. I mean, for starters, both run what could be called one-man shows. One of Nehru's biographers, S. Gopal, who watched Nehru very carefully, who'd been a close companion through much of his life, described India's government as a one-man show with Nehru as its sort of thaumaturgic personality. And one could say he also described Nehru's cabinets as a collection of moldering mediocrities. I guess
quite something.
He was quite stark. Gopal didn't shy away from using strong words, but something broadly similar could also be said for Modi and the sort of current dispensation, because if anything, Modi kind of towers above his cabinet and his party in a way that very few leaders have been able to do. And beyond that, there's also there are other similarities. I mean, they both have they're both centralizers. They both believe in a kind of in executive authority, in the centralization of power, for both questions of communitarianism, kind of trump questions of individual rights. Both are apt to deploy this trope of the state being under threat. And both, for that matter, have, in a sense, a very strong, open desire to leave a kind of deep imprint on history, to remake the country in line with their own visions. And I think you see that both in the importance, for example, both of them give to foreign policy, to traveling the world, to kind of their image as global statesmen. And the question of constructing like physical buildings. They're important to both of them as kind of a physical visual interpretation of their terms in power, and the kind of modernity that they seek to project. And so I think these are some quite obvious similarities that you'll see in the styles of leadership that for both Nehru and Modi.
Yeah, I wouldn't say you are a critic of Mr. Nehru. You're interested also in giving him credit where it's due. And I'd love for you to give us some points where Mr. Nehru meaningfully contributed to the India that we know today. And I'd love for you to conclude today's session with also telling us points in which you've changed your mind about Nehru over the years.
So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm a critic of Nehru either. And I guess there are so many people writing writing what is effectively a glorification of Nehru and Nehruvianism, that I do think in certain cases a pushback is required. But saying that, there are plenty of ways in which Nehru has contributed to the making of Indian democracy, and I'll start out with Indian democracy itself. If you compare Nehru with his compatriots across the post-colonial world, Indian democracy is an outlier. All of them, at some point or another, ultimately say, well, sovereignty lies beyond parliament, beyond constitution, beyond the sort of institutions of government. And so all of them ultimately can't work within democratic constraints. Sukarno, Nkrumah, Nasser, you take all of Nehru's compatriots. So the fact that we had a democratic transition from Nehru is probably the biggest compliment that he could be paid, because here was a man who could, should he have wanted, assume dictatorial power. He pushes the envelope, but he never quite tears it up. And that to me is a huge thing, because ultimately the temptation for absolute power is always there. And of course, you can argue that Nehru had no reason to go for that, because he was getting what he wanted within the democratic setup. And should push come to shove, he could, of course, utilize tools, as he did with the First Amendment, for example, to get what he wanted. And that's also a legitimate argument. But I think there is a lot to be said for the fact that Nehru constructed and then bequeathed a relatively functioning democracy to his successors. So that is one huge thing. The other thing was that Nehru was extremely fastidious with his work. So at no point, even if you see with the First Amendment, it's hurried through, but there's no all procedure is adhered to. There is a cabinet committee, there is a select committee from Parliament that looks through it. Parliament votes on it clause by clause. So Nehru is very fastidious in his work. He is dedicated to process, even though he has around him, as Gopal says, moldering mediocrities. He's quite insistent that cabinet meets as it's supposed to, select committees meet as they're supposed to, paperwork is done as it's supposed to. His commitment to, I guess, process is something that I really, really admire. And lastly, of course, is the fact that Nehru had a very childlike curiosity about the world. And this curiosity, in a sense, is one trait that I really, really admire about him. He never, when he writes Discovery of India, for him, it is very much, India is very much something that he set out to discover. And he, this sense of curiosity never leaves him. He's always, in a sense, learning, always seeking to engage with the outside world with the idea that there is something to learn and there's something to understand. And for nation building, that of course you saw that in the sort of great educational institutions that he set up. And I think those again are testament to the position that knowledge and learning had in his mental makeup, because of course, looking back, one might argue that he neglected primary education, and these were all elite setups for the Indian bourgeoisie to kind of replicate itself. And those are all legitimate arguments, but it's also worth thinking about the fact that he could also have gone completely the other way. He could have said, well, education is not the most important thing. The most important thing is building up an army, or something like that, as many of his compatriots again did. And those are all things that I really admire about him, and I think those are huge contributions to the making of the Indian nation.
Yeah. And what have you changed your mind about?
What I've changed my mind about really is actually Nehru's relationship with his other Indian political leaders, and I think there, particularly through the process of working on my third book with my friend Adil, it was quite instructive for me to see his sort of engagement with Iqbal, with Jinnah, with Iqbal and Jinnah especially, because I'd always had the impression that Nehru was, while he was willing to engage with his colleagues, with his opponents, a lot of it I thought was often driven by necessity rather than any investment in what might come out of that engagement. So in that, I didn't think it was always in good faith. But actually, I have revised that assessment, because looking at his engagement in the 1930s, before he achieves this sort of executive power, you see that actually Nehru is quite, in a sense, lawyer-like in trying to find some sort of common ground and a method of moving forward, both with Iqbal and with Jinnah. And he has no need to. He can perfectly well, with Iqbal, it's on a question of Islamic theology. It's on a question of, starts off with, what is the status of Ahmadis within Islam. And of course, it then expands to, the role of religion in public life itself. But, Nehru is in jail. Has no real need to engage with someone like Iqbal, where there's, very little meeting ground in itself. But he still does it. And I think that it really shows the kind of good faith interaction that he believes can, in a sense, lead to a way of working together and finding a road forward.
Awesome. Tripurdaman, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't, or any parting thoughts that you'd like to share with our community?
No, I'd just like to thank you for inviting me. It's been, it's been a great pleasure, and it's especially, great to be able to talk about my own intellectual journey in the context of the work that I'm doing, because I always talk about Nehru and about the Constitution and so on and so forth, and it's nice to be able to slot myself into my own work. And thank you very much.